Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, once again, we step gently into the past, where gaslight flickers through fog and silence hides behind corsets, coal dust, and unspoken rules. Whether you're nestled beneath your blankets or listening from a moment of quiet stillness, even, say, from a suspiciously reflective door, I'm honored to have your company as we explore the quiet lessons of time. If you're new here, do feel free to subscribe for more deep histories. And if this is your first time here, welcome. You've found a place where the lost voices of history are gently unearthed and softly retold. Now, close your eyes. And picture this. The cold, cracked porcelain beneath you begins to hum. Not unpleasantly, no. Like a whisper of time remembering itself. When you flush, you don't vanish down pipes. You fall backward through centuries, through soot and lace, through perfume and plague, through a narrow window into a world where women survived by selling not just their bodies, but their silence, their dignity, and sometimes their names. Tonight, we arrive in Victorian London. The year is 1863. The fog clings like a wet sheet to everything, to chimney stacks, to coal carts, to the hem of a maid's skirt. Gas lamps glow orange in the distance, blurring into halos of soot and smoke. Horses clatter over cobblestones, slick with the day's filth. And in the narrow alleyways off Whitechapel, you can hear it, the soft sound of laughter, bitter and brittle. Because behind the brickwork and brass knockers, the city is overflowing with contradiction, progress and poverty, industrial splendor and unwashed despair. It's a city of clocks and cages, and in its shadowed corners live the women no one wants to see. The women who became part of London's night, the prostitutes, the unfortunates, the fallen girls. No one knows exactly how many there were. Some claimed there were 8,000, others 80,000. The truth? Likely somewhere in between. What we do know is this. Most of these women didn't wake up one day and choose this life. They were pushed. By hunger. By lost jobs. By men who promised marriage then disappeared. By the unbearable math of survival. One loaf of bread versus one night of warmth. There were three attitudes toward prostitution in Victorian England. The first was condemnation, from the church, the law. The second was regulation. Parliament passed the Contagious Diseases Acts in theses, which allowed the police to forcibly examine women suspected of being prostitutes, often without cause or consent. This was done, they claimed, to protect soldiers from venereal disease. The women, their rights were rarely discussed. And finally, there were those who called for reformation. Social reformers, many of them women, began opening homes for rehabilitation, where girls could escape brothels and learn skills for respectable labor. But even these efforts, however well-meaning, were shaped by judgment and strict expectations of repentance. A woman could be saved but only if she acted like she'd been ruined. Meanwhile, the brothels thrived. Some were modest rooms with nothing more than a mattress and a cracked mirror. Others, like those on St. John's Wood or Soho, were gilded, velvet draped, and served gentlemen in top hats with cigars and champagne. But no matter the wallpaper, the exchange was the same. Time, body, coin. Most workers made pennies, barely enough to eat. Some clients refused to pay, others were violent. There were no unions, no protections, no safe words. And yet, for some women, this life was still preferable to starving or to being a domestic servant where the abuses could be just as brutal and less openly acknowledged. There were younger girls too, some, only 12 or 13, forced into the trade by guardians or pimps. Others lured with false promises of work. In 1885, the Pall Mall Gazette published a scandalous expose titled "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon," revealing how young virgins were being bought and sold to satisfy upper-class appetites. It shocked Victorian society, though the practice was far from new. And yet, amid all this cruelty, there were moments of sisterhood. Many women watched out for each other. They'd share stolen bread, give comfort when a client went too far, and whisper secrets in shared beds. Some taught each other to read. Others dreamed of saving enough for a little shop or a ticket to America. A few actually made it out. Most didn't. But whether you were a barmaid turned charity girl or a seasoned madam in charge of a parlor house, the truth of your life remained invisible to most. History rarely wrote your name. Yet you were there. You lived. You mattered. And you deserve to be remembered not as shame, but as survivors. Now, dear listener, let the lamps dim once more. Let the rain wash quietly down the cobblestones of forgotten alleys. Close your eyes and breathe. Slowly, deeply. You've walked long tonight through echoing halls of memory. The women of the past thank you for remembering their names, their faces, their stories. You've given them back a little piece of their dignity. As the gaslights flickered and the streets quieted beneath the moon's pale gaze, some of the brothel doors remained open, not for the women officially housed there, but for others who came and went in secret. Behind the fruit stalls, the tobacco carts, and the humble fishmongers' corners, another transaction took place, one born not of lust, but of necessity. Many lower-class women in Victorian London particularly the wives of street vendors, found themselves turning to prostitution as a means of survival. And far from being hidden, this arrangement was often sanctioned, even encouraged, by their husbands. While the man hawked newspapers or apples to passing strangers, his wife might quietly negotiate something else just around the alley. For some couples, this was a grim but mutual agreement. A wife might choose to sell herself on the side, adding coins to the family coffer to afford rent or boots for the children. For others, it was more sinister. The husband acted not as partner, but as pimp, lending out his wife as one might lend a horse, collecting payment in silence. Half of all street vendors' wives were believed to be engaging in this double life. There was no shame, not in the slums where children starved and landlords showed no mercy. There was only calculation. And for the men of means, the wealthy gentlemen who stepped from carriages with polished boots and silk gloves, there was never uncertainty about what they wanted. For them, even vice had a catalogue. They called them sporting guides. Leather-bound volumes passed discreetly through private clubs or ordered under false names. Inside, each page offered a different kind of merchandise. The women were listed by name or nickname, with details on age, hair color, bust size, temperament, nationality, and availability. Some were described as lively, others tender, some willing to be taught. A single night might cost £2 or £3, more than a working-class man earned in a month. Virgins, should they be listed, were priced much higher. These guides made selection mechanical, impersonal. The women weren't people. They were entries, options, fantasies, pressed into paper. And yet, it wasn't the buyers who were policed most harshly. It was the women, particularly in military towns, where soldiers and sailors passed through like tides. Brothels became both supply and scapegoat. Venereal disease had become a silent killer, robbing the British Army of healthy men faster than gunpowder. Young soldiers, barely 18, returned from brothels with infections that could render them blind, disfigured, or dead. Something had to be done, the government claimed. But rather than examining the men, they turned their gaze to the women. In 1864, the Contagious Diseases Act was passed. Its wording was cold, precise. In towns near naval bases or garrisons, any woman suspected of carrying an infection, even if she had never sold herself, could be stopped, questioned, and taken. If she refused a medical examination, she could be detained by force. The process was brutal. She would be strapped to a cold metal table, her legs bound, and subjected to an invasive inspection. Many described it as state-sanctioned assault. If the exam revealed signs of infection, she would be placed in a hospital for treatment. But this was not a hospital of mercy. These were locked institutions where women were held for up to 3 months, often longer, isolated from their families, their homes, and their children. Some never returned. And yet the law persisted for years, resisted only by the slow-growing cries of reformers and the women who dared to speak out. Through it all, the women endured, the catalogued, the suspected, the strapped, the silent. In drawing rooms and factory floors, in alleyways and candlelit chambers, they carried the weight of society's contradictions. Morality was preached in Parliament, but bought nightly in the back rooms of Soho. Respectability was demanded of women, even as their survival depended on being desired. The world judged them by what they gave, but never asked what had been taken. As the morning fog rolled in from the Thames and the first horse carts began to clatter through London's damp alleys, not all the women who'd worked through the night returned to their rented rooms. Some were taken not for selling their bodies, but for being too visible. Under the Town Police Clauses Act of 1847, the simple act of standing too long on a street corner, speaking loudly, or walking while intoxicated was enough to see a woman arrested. Though prostitution itself was legal, many of the behaviors that surrounded it were criminalized, and those arrested often faced sentences of up to a year in prison. No trial was needed for these petty offenses. A constable's word was enough. But not every woman was thrown into a cold cell and forgotten. Some were taken to what society deemed more redemptive places. They were called reformatories. These reformatories, often run by church groups or philanthropic ladies, claimed to offer fallen women a second chance. They were institutions built not of compassion, but of control. The belief was simple. A woman had turned to prostitution, not out of poverty or desperation, but because she was selfish, immoral, or weak. Reform was not about healing. It was about obedience. Daily life in the reformatories was austere. The women were made to wear identical dresses, scrub floors, pray, and submit to lectures on modesty, shame, and virtue. Inmates were discouraged from speaking, especially about their pasts. In silence, they were to be remade. reprogrammed into suitable daughters, servants, or wives. But many who passed through those doors never truly felt reformed. They simply learned to hide who they were, or to escape when they could. Yet while one part of society tried to erase desire, another profited from indulging it. Behind unmarked doors, across gaslit squares and velvet-curtained rooms, the brothels of Victorian London offered more than just physical release. They provided fantasy. Themed brothels flourished in the shadows of respectability. For some men, it was traditional companionship, soft words, a warm bed, a woman who would listen without judgment. For others, their appetites wandered further. There were establishments where spanking was not taboo, but routine, where men paid to be scolded and punished like schoolboys. Others offered services in the realm of domination and bondage, or cross-dressing experiences where identity itself was shed like clothing. Even homosexual brothels, illegal yet persistent, catered to those whose desires could not be spoken aloud in daylight. Here, in the candlelit corners of the city, men were free to explore what their marriages forbade. And always, it was the women who bore the price for that freedom. But for many of these women, the price was also a choice, and sometimes a lifeline. The Victorian economy offered few paths for female independence. If a girl was lucky, she might become a maid, a shop girl, a seamstress. Her days would be long, her pay meager, her position vulnerable. Even educated women who studied typing and shorthand, newly modern skills, often earned no more than 25 hours a year. It wasn't enough to rent a room, let alone support a child. Yet in the brothels, payment was nightly and sometimes generous. A beautiful woman, or even one with charm and wit, might earn more in a week than a factory girl made in months. Some became mistresses to wealthy men. Others dressed in silks, wore pearls, rode in carriages. From the outside, they looked like ladies. But behind each gloved hand and powdered cheek was a story of compromise. A trade, not always willing, but sometimes empowering, between body and autonomy. For many, prostitution was not just the highest paying job a woman could find. It was the only job where she owned her time. Still, owning your time was not the same as owning your life. There was always the risk of pregnancy, of disease, of violence, or simply of growing too old to be desired. The city had no pension for a woman whose beauty faded, and the world had no space for her regrets. Yet through it all, the women endured. Clever, resilient, hardened by necessity. They laughed when they could, loved when it was safe, and survived however they must. They were the forgotten queens of the underworld, painted, powdered, and unseen. But their stories have not vanished. They linger in the pages of old police records, in faded photographs, in whispered family secrets. And now, dear listener, the hour grows late. The rain on the cobblestones has slowed. The gaslights flicker low in the windows of shuttered houses. Let your thoughts drift like mist along the quiet streets. You've walked far tonight through shadows, silk, sorrow, and strength. As the lamps of Whitechapel dimmed behind the rising fog, change, too, was beginning to stir. Quiet, uncertain, but growing stronger, while the clatter of boots and whispers of business still echoed along narrow alleyways. A different kind of resistance emerged. Not in brothels or behind curtains, but in public meetings, pamphlets, and parliament. The Contagious Diseases Acts of 1864, 18th and 1869 were, on the surface, framed as protective measures, a medical necessity. But beneath the clinical language, a grim reality pulsed. These laws gave state officials the power to stop any woman at any time on suspicion alone and force her into a deeply invasive examination. The justification was national health. The true targets were poor women. The government's primary concern was not the suffering of women, nor their right to bodily dignity. It was the weakening condition of the British military. Soldiers, young and far from home, frequently visited brothels. And in a world before antibiotics, venereal diseases spread like fire through the ranks, disabling more men than bullets ever could. So instead of addressing soldiers' behavior or the lack of education and health care, Parliament placed the burden on the women. The women were detained. The women were examined. The women were punished. And in countless cases, they weren't even prostitutes. A factory girl walking alone at night, a mother hurrying through the docks in worn shoes, a servant out past curfew. Any one of them could be seized, inspected, and if found, unclean, held in hospital for months. Resistance slowly grew. At first, scattered voices, pamphlets printed on cheap paper, outraged letters to editors, quiet meetings in parlor rooms. But then came the firebrand women, women of education and privilege, who saw clearly the injustice. They were called blue stockings, meddlers, troublemakers, but they called themselves something simpler, defenders. Josephine Butler became one of the most fearless among them. A feminist before the word existed in its modern form, she traveled the country, giving speeches no man dared deliver. She condemned the acts not only for their cruelty, but for the double standard they enshrined, punishing the women while excusing the men. Her voice was not alone for long. She inspired a movement. The Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Their fight was not easy. They were mocked, threatened, accused of encouraging immorality. But they persisted. Through years of protest and debate, their arguments reached the ears of Parliament. And in 1886, after over 2 decades of enforcement, the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed. For many of the women affected, it was too late. The trauma endured, their names forgotten. But for those who came after, the repeal meant dignity. It meant the beginning of a reckoning, a small but vital shift in the way society viewed the rights of women, even those in its most shadowed corners. Prostitution in the Victorian era was never a simple tale. It wasn't only the story of crime or morality, of degradation or vice. It was a reflection of the times, of deep economic desperation, rigid gender roles, and a society that feared its own desires. For some women, it was survival. For others, a form of control. And for a few, perhaps even a kind of defiant freedom. But across every story, one truth remains clear. These were real women with real lives, real names, and real dreams. They laughed, cried, hoped, and endured. And despite all efforts to erase or shame them, their legacy lingers in the quiet victories of human rights, in the long road toward equality, and in the stories we tell when the world finally grows quiet. And now, dear listener, your journey through cobblestone streets and candlelit rooms has come to an end. The last page turns slowly. The voices of the past whisper soft goodbyes. Let your breath fall gentle. Let your thoughts rest easy. You've traveled far tonight, across years, across silence, across secrets. Thank you for keeping these stories company. Close your eyes, feel the hush of history around you, and know that even in darkness, understanding brings light. Good night, sleep soundly, and may peace find you softly, like the morning fog on old London stone.